but I like to be respectful of your time. All right, so what I want to do today is go through how I do or how I did a market analysis. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a relatively what I would consider to be an easier comparable, just because I think that when you're doing an example, I mean, this is going to work for probably 80% of cases, but you're always going to have 20% that are going to be harder. However, I think it's important to kind of lay that foundation, and this is always a good place to start. So feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go through.
Minimize my volume, or...
And then my intention is to go ahead and kind of be available to answer questions as we go through. And then what I'm going to do is at the end, I'm going to kind of take the questions that I get, and then I'm actually going to go back and create a Loom video of this whole thing that is just very clear, concise, and hopefully answer all of those questions that I got, so it can be very clear for you guys to reference whenever it's convenient. So does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, awesome. So basically, the first step in doing a really good CMA is really getting the information that you need. So, you know, one of the challenges, I think, one of the biggest things, and for those of you that have taken Bold before, or any kind of sales class around listings, I would say the pre-listing conversation or the pre-listing questionnaire is probably one of the most important pieces of a listing presentation, and it's probably also the most skipped part of the process. And the reason why that's important is because, you know, I'm going to show you all the ways you can go through and kind of get the most information without talking to the seller. However, the only way that you're really going to know the condition of the house currently before stepping through the door is to either have them send you pictures, which has been an effective way during COVID to get some of this information. And I still think that's one of the things that we could all take away from COVID, the way to get the true picture. Because of course, as you guys know, sometimes sellers tell you one thing and a different thing is true. But the second way is just to have a true conversation with them. So, you know, when somebody says that they have a new roof, a very valid question is, oh, awesome, you have a new roof. When did you actually put that roof on? And very many times as a listing agent, the answer was, oh, it was just in 2009. And to them, 2009 was new. I mean, I moved into my house in 2011, and when I bought my house, my roof was newer. And my roof was put on in 2008. To me, my roof still feels newer. But the reality is my roof is nearing the end of its useful life if I got a home inspection today. And so those types of pieces, or I'm sure for those of you that are experienced agents on here, you've never had a seller tell you that their kitchen, they recently redid it, and you walked in and it was recently redone in 1995. You know, and the reality is, obviously, the home improvement industry stays in business by making people want new stuff very often. And so what was really popular 5 to 7 years ago is not really popular now. And it's not going to bring, you know, if you redid your kitchen 7 years ago, it's not going to bring the same return on investment today as it would have if you would have sold 5 or 6 years ago. And so understanding and asking those questions 3 deep is absolutely imperative to running a proper CMA. So the first thing that you want to do, and these are kind of the things that I would look for, would be obviously you want to look for square footage. So if they've done any updates, usually they're going to tell you if they've added any space. So you're going to want to know about that. You're going to want to ask if they have a basement, number one, and if so, is it finished? And if it's finished, what kinds of finishes they have. Is it similar to the first floor? Is a finished basement, your version of a finished basement, painted concrete block, a piece of remnant carpeting, and a TV with the couch that has dog hair all over it? Like, is that your version of a finished basement? You know, those two things are very different. And then deck or patio, and these are some things I'll jump into later too as things to look for. And then also, you know, what's your lot characteristic like? Is there anything about your lot that would be a concern? And then obviously we talked about any other updates that we haven't talked about. So, you know, have you recently done flooring updates, paint and carpet, or paint? And then the last question would be, are there any updates that you know need to be done that you either plan on doing or you know should be done, but you're not planning on doing? And these are all pieces of information as you're going through comparing their subject property to the comparables that you need to know in order to make your job easier. Now, some agents do what we call a two-step listing appointment, where the first appointment is very much a fact-finding mission to find out a lot of these things, to have these conversations. And, you know, some agents definitely prefer to do it that way. I was always somebody that really liked to go on one appointment because time is valuable. And the reality is every time you step through that door, they want to tell you about their family. They want to talk to you about this and that and the other thing. And it's, for me, because I love to talk and I'm very relational, it was hard for me to get out of a house in under an hour, no matter what I was doing. So if it was 5 minutes that I needed to be there or 45 minutes that I needed to be there, it was just very hard. Now, my wife, Ashley, like, she will go in and out of a house in like 3.5 minutes if she's supposed to be there for 5 minutes, because she'll just ask them what she needs. Okay, great, see you later, and walk away with a big smile, and that works for her. I just can't do that. So my natural personality, I needed that one appointment. Otherwise, I would have done a lot less business. So after we get as much information as we can, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Then the next step for me was always to go ahead and jump into the MLS. So again, I'm going to do that here and share my screen. So give me 1 second. All right, can everybody see that? Thumbs up. I think you guys are all muted, which is perfectly fine with me, but Krista, can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
we see it.
Awesome. All right, so this should look familiar to everybody. Can you guys see yourselves too, or just my screen?
We can see the people that have video, yes, and you and the screen.
Okay, I'm gonna move that then, just so you guys can see the whole screen. All right, so basically what I did was, for purposes of this conversation, I just picked a random property that sold more than a year ago, and don't ask me why Hilliard Green came to mind, but I picked it. So the first thing I'm gonna do is go in and see if it's ever been listed in the MLS. Now, the reason I say ever is because obviously it could be a new property. And then also, when I got my license, which was a long time ago in 2004, it was just after you were allowed to put, when I got my license, you could put no more than 10 pictures in the MLS. And that was like a recent improvement. Most of the previous listings sometimes had one picture and sometimes had no pictures. And so some of my habits kind of are left over from a long time ago. But now most listings, especially if they're more than a few years old, have sold before. And so you want to find it in the MLS. So I picked this random property in Hilliard Green. It sold last year for actually in 2018 for $199. And basically, if it's been in the MLS and it has good amount of pictures, this can be a treasure trove of information, especially if it's been listed recently. So obviously you're going to use the photos to kind of look at the condition. You're going to be able to compare that to what the seller said the condition is now and kind of and go from there. But again, the big things I'm looking for are to verify square footage, bedrooms, bathrooms. Now from the listing, we're going to also be able to click on the county here. So if you guys have never done this or you're not super familiar with the MLS, there's 2 links in each listing that are super valuable. Number 1 is the parcel number. It's a hyperlink. When you click on it, it opens up what we call Realist. And here in a second, it's going to take us there. And so Realist is going to give us just some additional information to kind of validate what the seller told us. Or if the seller hasn't told us anything because for whatever reason we can't get the information out of them, this is going to just bring the information in. So it's going to give you essentially auditor's data mixed with MLS data for you to kind of look at. Now again, I would not take this as gold or a guarantee of information. However, they are going to it is going to give you some good information. And then recently, over the last couple years, and maybe it's been longer than that, but again, like I said, I've been in this business for a while, the listing MLS information started getting pulled in here, which is valuable as well, because it really gives you the opportunity to compare the MLS data with the auditor's data. And so then when you roll down here to the bottom, this is mostly auditor's data. It's showing you all the times that the property was transferred and for what price. And then lastly, which this was one of my favorite things, and it's less important right now in our current market. However, from 2008 to 2012 or 13, this information was super important to me. And the reason it was super important to me was because sometimes this information was going to tell me that these sellers really couldn't sell. When the market was depreciating, when we were losing value, if I came in here and everything in the neighborhood was selling for 180 and these guys just bought 1.5 years ago or 2 years ago for 193, we needed to call and have a different conversation. You know, are you comfortable doing a short sale? Do you have cash to pay the difference, et cetera, et cetera? So this is just preparing me for what kind of conversation we're going into. The other thing that is important even today about this is if somebody did buy just 2 years ago, what's that property going to sell for now? And when I do a net to seller sheet, are they going to be above water or below water? And these are all important conversations, because you could spend a couple hours preparing for a listing appointment, go on an hour-long listing appointment, or maybe longer, depending on how much you like to talk. And at the end, find out that actually when you pull out the seller net sheet that they can't actually make enough money to get out of the house, and they didn't realize that they had to pay the commissions because when they bought as a first-time home buyer, they didn't have to. So that's the kind of stuff I'm looking at there. And then when I click on the county link, it's going to take me to the auditor's page. Again, I'm just verifying what's going on here, verifying the lot size, and then also looking at what the auditors got here. The other thing, the biggest thing that I like to look at on here was the taxes. So I want to make sure that they're current on their taxes. And so here you can click on tax and payments in Franklin County, at least, and all the other counties you can as well. It's just not maybe in the same spot. And you're going to see kind of what people are paying in terms of taxes, make sure they're paid up to date, all of that kind of stuff. And this is also going to be important information for your net to seller sheet as well. So going into the CMA. So now that I've got all this stuff, now what I typically do is I usually right click on my tab up here and I click on duplicate tab, or duplicate tab if I'm in Chrome. And the reason is I like to keep this open as a reference point while I'm doing my CMA, because sometimes based on what I look at for my CMA, I'm not always going to have access to this. So you're either going to want to print out the old MLS form, or you can keep these tabs open here just so you can kind of refer back to them. So the first thing I'm going to do when I'm doing a CMA is jump into quick search. And this should all look familiar to all you guys. And I'm going to come down here to the lower right-hand corner where this little pin is, and I'm going to type in 2309 Shelby. And I will tell you, this is like the least the least mature search that I'm probably use on a regular basis, because you have to basically type in every field. So it's not anything like the MLS. Is it 026 or 26? 43026, right?
026.
Yeah. Man, see, this is me getting rusty, guys. If I ever go back to sales, you better take advantage of me because I'm going to be real rusty by then.
You can, that's funny, Troy.
All right. So basically, though, the value of this is that it's going to show us the location of the house. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple reasons why I do this. The biggest initial reason why I started using the location was really just so I could have the location, and I'll show you how I use that here in just a second. But the other value to having the location is I'm going to be able to see some things from here that I want to be paying attention to when I'm looking at the comparables. So I'm going to click on use this location, and that's going to basically make that pin stay there. Now I'm going to show you what happens. I'm going to use my own, see if it'll autofill. It will. I'm going to use my own address to show you what happens. If you don't say use this location, the pin moves as you move the map. So if you have a bunch of houses in a small area, that can get really confusing. So anyways, I'm going to remove this location here quickly and go back to Hilliard. So that was probably the hardest way I could have done that, and that's the reason why I'm going to come back in here and re-record this. But so now we have the pin here, so I'm going to zoom back in. Now, the goal of pinning is twofold. Number one, that pin's going to stay there when I'm starting to look at comparables. But number two, the other thing that that's going to do is it's going to give me the ability to see, okay, what neighborhood is this in, right? So we know from the MLS, because if we look at subdivision, if it's input correctly, which that's not a required field in the MLS, but most agents use it, that it's in Hilliard Green. But the question is, as you get more and more comfortable doing CMAs, you're going to be able to realize where the neighborhood is. So if I had to ask you, and because we're not in person, it's going to be really difficult for me to ask somebody to show me, where do you think the neighborhood is? But I'm going to show you what I'm looking at with this map. So because I see the pin is there, neighborhoods, especially planned neighborhoods, so I would say neighborhoods that are newer than like the 70s, or probably 70s or newer, probably even in the 60s, but not as much. They're very planned, and so you can see basically they typically have 1 or 2, maybe 3 entrances to main roads. So even though this looks really messy here, what I see is one road coming in here that zigzags and connects to all these, and then one other road going out here. And so what I can see is all those connected properties, I'm going to assume are the same neighborhood. So the first thing that I would do is draw a square around that. Now let's say it wasn't that obvious. What I like to do is go in here. We saw that the neighborhood was Hilliard Green. So I'm going to type it in the subdivision name, and that's awesome. Now remember what I said, Hilliard Green, the subdivision name is not a required field, which means someone could type in Hilliard Green like this, and there's actually, oh, there's not. But if they added an E on there, it could still be in the neighborhood, but if you only use the subdivision name, then you're gonna miss out on it. So what I'm gonna do next is go in and select the active, contingent, pending, and closed. The MLS is gonna automatically create a look back time of 1 year or 367 days. And it is going to show me that all of these properties sold in the last 12 months that were labeled as the neighborhood Hilliard Green. So the value in that is going to be that I can see very clearly that all of this area is Hilliard Green. And so that makes it really easy. Now let's say you're in a smaller neighborhood. Like if I went over here, actually I could use this probably as an example. If I went over here and Drew around here, because I don't remember what the name of that neighborhood is, although I've sold there before, there's not going to be very many solds in that neighborhood. So there's only 6. So if that was a larger neighborhood, I might go back 24 months just to get a bigger sample size and make sure that my data was accurate. So I have more to choose from there. Does that make sense for everybody? Because I think that's a really super important point. So you're not guessing. Did I lose anybody with that?
No, we're good. I'm
No,
good.
you're good. Okay. Please, no question is a bad question, because I guarantee you, if you're thinking it, there's probably other people. So again, if we check this box, we're going to see that Hilliard Green is going to have a bunch. I'm going to move this back to 12 months. And so then I'm just going to take this outline here and I'm going to go around this neighborhood. Now I know, because I'm familiar with this area, that these are apartments. And so, but I'm still, let's assume it's another neighborhood. I'm going to go around it like this. So now let's see, and we'll see if this is accurate. So right now we have 41 properties that are either active, sold, or currently in contract that fit within this square and have the subdivision name Hilliard Green. Now let's see if this is one of those examples. I should have searched for a neighborhood. Here it is. It was a good example. So do you guys see what number this says now? It says 45. So that means that if all I would have done was type in the subdivision, it would have given me a great sample size. And yet, guess what? What if one of those 4 homes that sold that didn't have the correct subdivision name was the house next door to the house that you're going to visit, and it was the highest sale that had happened in the neighborhood in the last 12 months. And you came with all these comps and you were super excited because you had the price nailed. And they go, well, what about the one that sold in January for like 240? You want to know why I do this? Because I've had that happen before. So never depend on the subdivision name for your area. Always draw in the map, because having the position of the pin on the house, if you ever listed a property, that is something that's required by the MLS, and there are fines if you get it wrong. And so that's much more dependable than the subdivision name. So obviously, oh, go ahead.
Is there a reason why you don't include the expireds and the withdrawals?
Mostly because in our market, number one, there's very few of them. And number two, it only tells us what not to price it at. It doesn't necessarily tell us what's been successful. So in a declining market, the expireds are super, super important. And I think if you are struggling with comparables, I would go back. But I don't think that in this kind of a market, there's a ton of value, because most properties in this type of a market. So to answer your question, you probably should as a rule of thumb. But I would say in this market, there's usually extenuating circumstances as to why something would expire. But if it is a little bit situational, but I struggle with it because there's no end to it. And so it's hard, like if something expired 6 months ago, how much impact or how much does that really correlate with what's happening today?
Well, the reason why I include them is because, like for pricing, like it gives me an argument of if it was overpriced, then
yeah,
it gives you that ammunition to be able to fight if they want to go completely outside of the realm of your pricing, and you give them an example of, well, this is what's going to happen if you overprice it. No one's going to buy it, kind of thing. But thank you for answering my question.
I love that though, and I would tell everybody that even though that wasn't something I did or have done regularly in an appreciating market, that is a very good idea and something I'm going to add to my list, because it's probably something that you should stay in the habit of, no matter what.
Troy, have you ever used the search from the auditor's website on recent sales?
Yeah, I tend, and the reason that I'm assuming you would do that would be to catch stuff that was sold off market, like not in the MLS.
Is it not worth it? Am I being overkill?
No, I would, if I was going to do that, I have done that before, but I would use Realist, because Realist has a feature that allows you to draw on a map, and it's much easier to compare. And because Realist links with the MLS, you can sort it and it'll show you the ones that weren't sold in the MLS.
Yeah, I just try and figure out why they're not in there. And
Yeah.
then how long does it take for Realist to update?
I think it's monthly. Does anybody else know the answer to that? I used to know. Now, I want to say it's at a minimum monthly, if not more often. They just recently did an update last year, and I want to say that improved from that.
So recent sales wouldn't be in there, right? So that's why we would go to the auditor's website.
Yeah, but I mean, I could make an argument, especially right now, that the auditor site probably isn't recording deeds immediately either.
Right. No, I know I'm anal. I need
No,
to.
but I would tell you that doing all of that stuff is absolutely adds value.
Or it slows me down.
And it also could slow you down. So yeah, I would just it's a good check. I would probably just use Realist, and if somebody called me on it, I would say, that's great information. It wasn't showing up in my records because it was a non-MLS sale. So I'll definitely go back and take a look at it. And if I feel like it causes me to adjust the price, then I'll do that. But yeah, it's because of the time investment. And usually when you're comparing actives and in contracts as well, it's very rare that an off-market sale is going to improve the price for the seller. If anything, it's usually not going to improve the price for the seller. But yes, I mean, there's also an argument that you should go on Zillow, right, to see if there's any FSBOs. I mean, you could spend your whole life looking, but I think ultimately the MLS has, 92% of homes are listed by an agent. So I always, depended on that and didn't get caught too many times. Lisa, did you have something to add?
Yeah, the other thing that I always talk about is everything that's in the MLS, the sold properties have that 6% realtor fee already baked into the price. So if we're looking at off-market properties, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a little lower than what the price actually could be because they're not calculating into realtor fees. I mean, they could be, maybe not, but that's another,
Objection
conversation, to have.
Yeah, if they bring it up. Yeah, because I think it's that fine line always, right, between your fiduciary duty and protecting your time. But the reality is that it takes those programs are not designed to make it easy for us to search. And so it could take a lot of time to find one really underpriced property, or sometimes none. All right, so now we're gonna jump into how to actually compare the properties. So this is a good neighborhood from the perspective that there's a lot of turnover. And so one of the things that I'm going to encourage you guys to do, and this is another class, but this was something that saved me a ton of time, is to go in and actually create views in your MLS. So one of the things that I did was I created a Troy search view within the MLS. And you can always go to the videos in the MLS if you want to know how to do this ahead of time. And next time I teach a class, I'll do a Loom video on it. But basically what I liked about this is it gave me the ability to really quickly look at all the important pieces of comparables. And so what I have going on here, so if we go back to this, we had 1,473 square feet. Now, I know about this neighborhood that it's a very kind of cookie cutter neighborhood, and most of the houses, there's a lot of the same floor plans in there. So the first thing I would do with a house like this is look at the square footage and sort the entire list by documented square footage. And if you guys are familiar with documented versus approximate total finished living space, or ATFLS, that's going to show up here. And primarily, especially in this price range, when you get into higher price ranges, the ATFLS could be due to an addition or things like that. But especially in like that, you know, under 350 price range, or maybe even 450, depending on the area, you're definitely, usually your footprint is going to have stayed the same. And then the ATFLS is going to represent either an added like 3-season room or a finished basement more often than not. So
Yes,
it's
these
going
all
to,
Dominion homes. These
yeah,
are-
so it's going to
so many
be,
of these new.
how many of them did you sell, Carissa, when they were new? A lot,
Just
right?
a lot.
Yeah. So you're gonna, so I'm gonna look at the ATFLS, and I'm just gonna look through here and see. So that one was 1,437 square feet. And the other thing that I'm gonna look at is the style, because sometimes this one is a 2-story, but sometimes you're gonna get, you know, split levels, ranches, and those are gonna price differently. So the first thing I'm gonna do is look in here at both the style and the square footage. So when we look at style on this one, we've got, and we look around that same square footage, we see that there's some split levels that are right above it. And then starting at 1,440 square feet, we've got a 2-story. So I'm just gonna start checking these properties. But this is a perfect example. Look, one of the first comps that we're gonna select is one that didn't have a subdivision name in it. So there's just a reminder. So I'm gonna look at square footage and style. Sometimes people put style in wrong. So again, be careful. If I would have gone right out and edited my search for 2 stories, I would have lost this comp. There's no 3-story houses in this neighborhood, but somebody checked the wrong box when they were doing it. So I'm gonna look at all of these properties that are in this similar range. I'm probably gonna hop down here to, I'll probably look at a couple of these smaller ones. And primarily the reason for that is I'm looking at the price range, and I'm seeing that even at a smaller square feet, that they're still selling. So I'll probably pop through here and select those. And then I'm gonna go down here, and this is gonna be a lot just because this is a neighborhood where a lot of places sell. And I'm gonna look at some of these. Now this is kind of where I'm gonna stop because I've already got a lot of properties. And then what I'll typically do is look up here, there's 45 results and 15 are selected. So if you click the selected button, it's gonna make all those other ones disappear. So now I've got 15 properties that look to be the same. Now the other thing, if I go back here and look at my subject, the big thing that jumped off the page to me about this subject is that it's only got 1.5 baths. So the difference between 1 full bath and 2 full baths, for those of you that have sold a lot, it can be significant. So I'm gonna uncheck all of these, and I'm gonna look through here under baths, and I'm gonna see here's one with 1.5 baths. And I'm only seeing 1.5 bath in here, so that's significant. The rest of them are 3 bedrooms, 2-car garage. And now I'm gonna take a look, and one of the things that I see right off the bat here is that if we sort these by price, is that property with 1.5 baths is the least expensive property of all of them. So that's definitely something that should jump off the page. Now, if we go back to the pictures, I'm going to look at this, especially in one of these Dominion style neighborhoods where everything looks the same. We've got 1 story here, 2 story there above the garage. If I click on this picture, I've got 1 story here, 2 story above the garage. So we're going to jump into photos, and we're going to see that this is pretty much exactly the same house, I believe. Except not quite as updated, if you remember. So this is going to be a really good comparable. And then I'm just going to jump through here and look at some of these other ones, because remember, we know that they're all through the same similar square footage. And it's just the difference between 1.5 baths and 2.5 baths, but we start going up in price. So then I'm going to start looking at closing date as well. So unfortunately, that one that's a really good comparable for us sold almost a year ago. So now I would probably sort these again by date just to see what the most recent solds are. And so I'm going to start to look at, you know, what's been happening from a trend perspective off of price. So if you look at price compared to kind of the beginning of the year, I'm not seeing a lot of changes. And obviously these are all 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, some of them the exact same floor plan. And we're just not seeing a lot of change. So I'm going to start feeling comfortable with the numbers. I mean, some of these back from last summer, we're seeing, you know, some higher, some bigger gaps, but overall there hasn't been a ton of change. So now what I'm going to do is go and look at what's in contract right now. And I'm going to see that even these, like, we're seeing a really distinct thing. Is anybody else seeing what I'm seeing from these 2 comparables? I'm seeing that the list prices are exactly the same, and they're trying to stay under 250. And when I look at the most recent closed, it was 248, 250, 247.9. And then when we go back to pre-COVID, I see a 259.9. And then in December, there was a 269.9. So it appears that the trend in this neighborhood has gotten a little bit conservative. Now, some of that could have been COVID related. And the reality is with these, because we know inventory is tight right now and there's nothing active on the market, I'm going to be reaching out to these agents to try to see if they're willing to tell me, you know, what they're in contract for. Because what I know about the Hilliard market from talking to you guys is that these properties are usually getting multiple offers and going over list price. So I'm going to be asking 2 questions. Number 1, what was the activity like? And number 2, can you tell me the price? And I guess the third question is, when is it closing? Because the reality is, and this is what I want to talk about in a minute, it doesn't matter what we think the price should be or what the seller thinks the price should be. The appraiser is going to determine whether or not we can actually get that price unless somebody's paying cash. And so one of my favorite things to talk about in a listing presentation is Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I have to sell your house 5 times. Can I explain that to you? I'm going to say, number 1, I have to sell it to the agent, because the reality is that, and you all have done it, you've had a client send you a property that they want to go look at, and you had a birthday party for a family member or a friend or something that evening, and you pulled it up on the MLS, and your goal was to shoot every hole that you could in that property to figure out how you didn't have to show it tonight, unless it was perfect for them. And so even in this type of a market, the showing fatigue is real. And nobody wants to drive 20 minutes to go show a property, spend 30 minutes in the house to find out that there was something we could have seen from the MLS that would have made it not work. So number 1, we have to sell it to the agent. Number 2, we have to sell it to the client, right? The buyer. They have to want to write an offer on it. The third person I have to sell it to is the home inspector. The fourth person, which is the person you thought I was going to talk about, is the appraiser. And then the fifth one is somebody that no one ever talks about, and that is that I have to sell it to the underwriter. Because what most people, even a lot of agents, don't understand is that the appraiser turns in the appraisal form to the lender, and then the lender, once it comes into the lender, an underwriter has to look at it and make sure they agree with the price based on the data that the appraiser sent in. Right now, banks are getting very conservative. They're holding on to their cash. They don't necessarily want to lend it. They're nervous about what's going to happen. And so there's a higher than normal likelihood that even if an appraiser files a report that says it meets or exceeds value, that an underwriter is going to kick it back. Now, the problem is you guys say, well, it's never happened to me before. Well, the problem is you don't get notified that the underwriter kicked it back. The underwriter gets the report, sends it back to the appraiser and says, I want 2 more comparables that support this price because of blank, blank, and blank. And when in a down market or a challenging economy, that happening is going to be even more likely. So definitely be keeping that in mind. So the reason I jumped into that is that even though last winter there was a place selling for $259, $269, if these properties sell for $250, the appraiser isn't going to give you a value based on the 6-month-old comp versus the brand new comp. And then even if they do, the underwriter might give us pushback. So keep that in mind. And then the other problem is that we've got this one with 1.5 baths that sold. So when I'm looking at, so what I would do in this case is I would also, the first thing I would do would be to look at what the places with 2 full baths sold for last year, right around when this sold. And what we're seeing is that they were selling for around $240. And then they started kind of inching up a little bit into the $250, but kind of stayed around $240. And then not until winter time and first quarter, and if you guys remember, first quarter was actually a pretty busy quarter, they started to jump up to $250 and actually above $250. So what I'm seeing is that there's probably about a $10,000 movement in the overall price, meaning that if I was pricing a property at last summer compared to what I would have done in first quarter, I would have probably had a $10,000 to $20,000 bump just based on what I'm looking at here. So I would apply that, and I would probably say, you know, based on what I'm seeing, I'm thinking that I would probably put this at about $235 or $240. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to compare our property to some of these other ones real quick, because I do think that our property from an updates perspective, especially on the inside, the yard was awesome with the deck, but the inside leaves a little bit to be desired. I would say that our property was probably a little bit more updated. But beyond that, you know, they're definitely pretty similar. This is, even though this isn't quite as updated, it's a very clean property, well listed, good pictures, again, nice deck. So we're going to come back here and look at the bathroom. I'm just double checking here to make sure that truly is only one bathroom. Yeah, it's just connected. All right, I'm gonna look and see. We've got a deck as well, although it doesn't look to be in as good a shape. Fenced yard, not probably in as good a shape. But if we come back here, so this one's got a super nice yard, super clean house, but just not quite as updated. Also no finished basement in this one. So again, a really good comparable. I'm just gonna jump over here to this one that looks to be almost exactly the same, but just had a second full bath. I would say similar, you know, similar finishes. So basically what we're seeing here, I did have an island too, but what we're seeing here is that there was about a $10,000 to $15,000 difference, actually about a $15,000 difference between a property that had 2 full baths and a property that had 1 full bath. So I'm going to go back here and just double check. I'm going to grab these 2, which sold right around that comparable. And then I'm also going to grab these 2 that are in contract, because especially with COVID, I feel like it's going to be very representative of the current market. And then maybe these 2 most recent sales, and then we'll pare them down here in a second. So I'm going to go back to all the results, and I'm just going to sort these real quick here by full bathrooms, just to see if there's any 1.5 baths that we need to be aware of. I'm going to see this one that sold in November. It's a much smaller documented square footage with 1.5 bath that sold for $209. And then I see this one that sold last August for $215. So now what I'm seeing, and this is why it's important to go back once we realize that we're kind of out of our environment when we look at just the square footage. What I'm seeing here is that, you know, the 1.5 baths are selling for quite a bit less. Now, obviously we have a little bit less square footage. So then I'll jump to the price per square foot, and I'll see, okay, now I feel a little bit better. It really has more to do with the 1.5 bath. So I'm gonna feel pretty good about where I'm at here, adding about 15,000 onto this. And so I would go in with this based on these comparables at probably about 240, unless I called those other agents and they told me they were in contract and the appraisal had already come through, and let's say they're selling for 260. Then I would come in and I would say to the seller something like this: Mr. and Mrs. Seller, the current numbers for closed properties tell us that your property should be listed probably somewhere between 235 and 245. Because of what I know about the properties that are in contract, as long as they close, which they're scheduled to close on X date and X date prior to us getting an appraisal completed, then I feel like we might be able to push it to 250. So Mr. and Mrs. Seller, let me ask you a question. Most people, most sellers that I sit down with, they care about one of 2 things more than anything else. One is time and one is money. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, which one of those is most important to you? And they're either going to say, I want to get the most price no matter, the highest price no matter what, or I love those prices, because to be honest with you, I only paid $199 for this 2 years ago, and my husband or wife has already moved to California, and I can't fathom being a single parent any longer. So whatever that conversation looks like, then we would pick within that range and we would go from there. Now, in terms of the presentation, what I did, and I'm somewhat old school, I would probably narrow this down to 5 of the most comparable properties. And then the other thing that I would do is I would print off what we call a 1-line CMA. So let me ask you before I can save these to a collection. So I can always come back to those. I'll come back to the comps in a second, but I want to show you what I use the 1-line CMA for. So I'm going to pull up the 1-line CMA, and I always pull up the 1-line CMA for the entire neighborhood. And the reason I do that is the same reason why I don't search by subdivision. And that's because I never wanted to have no information on a house that sold next door. So even if the house next door was, you know, twice as large, and that's the reason why I didn't use it as a comparable, I wanted to be able to have a sheet to reference to be able to talk about every single property that was available in their neighborhood and that had sold in the last 12 months. And so that's why I would print this off. The other reason why I would print this off is because there's some really valuable data in here. And the biggest two pieces of information that I want to know from this document, which aren't really valid when you get down into the 3 to 7 comparable range, is what is the average and median days on market? And then also I want to know kind of what the average price per square foot is. Now, if you notice, I very rarely am going to address the average price per square foot. And the reason is, especially in a cookie cutter neighborhood like this, if we look at the data, the trend is always going to pull the price per square foot to the middle. So you're going to see that smaller properties tend to sell for a higher price per square foot, and larger properties tend to sell for a lower price per square foot than others in the neighborhood. So you can't just take the average price per square foot here and multiply it out times the square footage that you have, because if you do that, if you have the smallest house in the neighborhood, you're going to end up underpricing it. And if you have the largest house in the neighborhood, you're going to end up overpricing it.
Troy, why is it that the smaller houses sell for a higher square footage?
That's a great question.
Price per square foot?
The reason is this. It's for all the people that want to be in a neighborhood but can't afford to be in the neighborhood. So if you can find the least expensive house in a neighborhood, and this is a bad example because it's a first-time buyer neighborhood, but let's say you were in a neighborhood that sells for $300,000 to $400,000. The smaller house in the neighborhood that sells for $300,000 is probably going to be the smallest house in the neighborhood. Could you agree?
Yes.
It might also be the same size of house that's in the move-up neighborhood, meaning the neighborhood that they're coming from. However, because it's in a neighborhood with $400,000 houses, they might have been required to put all natural exteriors on. And they might have been required to, have this certain floor plan thing that they didn't have in the cheaper neighborhood. And then on top of that, so there's usually a few more upgrades that are showing up in that, but more than anything, the reason why compared to the houses in the neighborhood is because the people that are moving from the buyers that are looking right underneath of that property, or maybe even at the same price as the largest house in the neighborhood that they're moving up from. And so when somebody's looking at those two, a lot of times they're willing to pay more for a house that's in the next level neighborhood that is exactly the same size as the largest house that's in the neighborhood that people were moving from.
Okay.
I'm not sure I explained that correctly, but did you follow me?
I think so. I'm going to go back and listen to it again.
Okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It's basically because of the fact that each neighborhood brings a certain amount of prestige and value for just being in that neighborhood.
Yes.
And so when you're in the smallest house, when you only go by price per square foot, you typically aren't factoring in that value. And on the contrary, when you start getting up into the higher end of a neighborhood, you start getting close to that what they could do in a different neighborhood that's in a house in a neighborhood with an even more prestigious. And so when you get up into the higher end of the neighborhood, that becomes a little bit less desirable than if they could move up into the next quote unquote level of neighborhood.
Yeah. So they're not willing to pay more for something or pay that price for something when they can pay a little bit more and just be in a completely different ballpark.
Yeah, or if you think of it this way, they're not willing to pay the same price for the same size house that's in that next neighborhood.
Yes.
They have to be getting something extra, and typically that extra is the size.
Okay.
And vice versa on the lower end. People are willing to go into that neighborhood and pay a little bit more to be in the neighborhood. and what they're sacrificing is the size.
I gotcha. That makes total sense. Thank you.
And then also the other conversation too is that oftentimes the ranches tend to be the smaller square footage, and those also tend to sell for a higher price per square foot as well. So that also factors into it sometimes, but not always.
And that's because of demand for the ranches, right?
Partly because of demand and partly because stairways waste space.
Mm,
And so, you know, having to move the floor plan around to work around a stairway, it wastes some more space than a ranch. So a ranch has more livable space in it with the same or less square footage.
okay.
If you think about the flow of ranches,
Yeah.
because we don't think about it a lot when we're just like calculating numbers. But if you think about the flow of a house, how much space has to be open around the bottom and top of a stairway in order to make it functional?
Yeah.
So all of that space, like in terms of furniture position and things like that, is wasted. So it's not something that buyers ever talk about when they're in the house, but it's what they feel. So when you start to hear buyers say things like, you know, oh, this just feels smaller, or this just feels bigger, a lot of times it's that functional thing that you're thinking. So my encouragement, and that actually brings up a really good comment that I hadn't thought of, but one of the biggest values, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but one of the biggest values of really getting good at pricing is working with buyers, because it's really difficult to truly grasp and understand all of these nuances that kind of roll off of my tongue. But I can tell you it took years of making mistakes to learn this. But those types of nuances that you're looking at, you know, another big thing to pay attention to is yard size. You know, you have to think about, you know, and we have to be careful with fair housing and all of that, but you have to think about who your most likely audience is going to be. You have to think about marketing the property. If you're selling a 3,500 square foot house with 4 bedrooms that are all upstairs and there's no backyard, who's the most likely buyer for a 3,500 square foot house with 4 bedrooms upstairs?
Family.
A family. And guess what families have? They have dogs that they want a fenced yard for, and they have swing sets. And early on in my career, I remember listing this house. It was in Polaris Green, I think. And if you guys, I'm almost positive, the neighborhood backs up to a really old neighborhood. And when they built it, they had to really put a huge swale, or some people call them French drains, whatever, in the backyards of all the houses that were on the back end, because the old neighborhood didn't have any drainage. And so in order to make sure the houses didn't flood when it rained a lot, they had to add a bunch of drainage. Well, because of that swale, it took a normal, and there was like a 2.5 foot drop off, and the yards were already small in this house, and it was in 2011. And so it was hard to sell anything anyways. And this house, I mean, we had like 50 showings on it and no offers. And it wasn't because of anything other than the backyard, because people couldn't put a swing set in the backyard. And obviously that was in an environment where properties were hard to sell because there were a million of them. And yet the reason I tell you that is when you're working with buyers and showing them houses, remember that they may not be selling this property in a market like we're in today, number one. And number two, even in this market, when you're comparing properties, like what happens if every other house in this neighborhood has gotten 6 offers and you only get 1? When you get 6 offers, how many times, Lisa or Joan, who are on this call, when you've gotten 6 offers and 5 of them have been at or below list price and one of them was 10,000 over? And that one that was 10,000 over is the one that closes. And that's the only one that shows up in the MLS. And so everybody else is like, oh my gosh, like, look, it's so easy to sell. We got 10,000 over list price. And yet what the market was actually telling us is that that house was at or overpriced. But we had one desperate person who had already lost 6 properties and they weren't going to lose this one.
Yeah.
But the current market that we're in, what I'm hearing you guys telling me is that on a property that in the first quarter you would have gotten 6 offers on, you're now getting 2. Or if a property in the first quarter you would have gotten 30 offers on, you're now getting 12. And what that's telling me is that we have to be really careful. The other thing, even though we're seeing high demand right now, the other thing that we've got to be cognizant of is that we're still in an uncertain economic situation. I mean, I know 3 people that got laid off last week. They made it through all of COVID and then got laid off last week. And so what we really have to make sure that we're doing is that we're pricing and we're giving a price now, and we're also explaining to our clients that we're in uncertain economic times right now. And the market is this today. However, before we go on the market, if that's going to be 3 weeks from now, I'm going to look at all the data again, and we're going to see where things are at then. And you're going to go through and just kind of validate what you've already done. The last thing that you guys are going to want to do that I always did, and then I'll kind of take you through what my conversation looked like kind of from beginning to end with when I was sitting in front of the client, which I know we're not here to talk about the listing presentation itself, but I think it kind of brings everything together when you're doing a CMA. But what I'm going to do is, so in Hilliard, we're looking at 200 to 250. So what I'm going to do is come into Trend Graphics, which the login for Trend Graphics is on kwcresources.com. I'm going to come down here to this drop down and click for sale, sold, pended, new listing. That's going to give me a blue line here that shows all the new listings per month, and this is the overall market. But what I would always do, and my rule of thumb was, I always split up single family homes and condos because those do change. So I would select single family homes. I would go to Hilliard. Whoops, I can spell. H is before I. I would click on the Hilliard School District. And then I would also do price range because price range is extremely important, especially if you're going, I would probably go to 275 actually. Because especially if you're going into the higher price ranges, you go in with data and say it's an average of 9 days on market, and you're going to be setting some unrealistic expectations. So I would pull out this. And so when I sat down with somebody to talk about their house, I would start with this, and I would say, we're going to go ahead and start with a 30,000 foot view. So first I'm going to talk about what's happening in Hilliard right now in your price range. You know, I would say, I think that you're going to be competing with homes that are between 200 and 275. That's the buyer range that we're going to be looking in. And this is what's happened with the market. And so I'm going to sit down with this sheet of paper and I'm going to say there's some really important things. In a normal market, what I would use this for is I would use this to talk about seasonality. So I would use this to show them that actually in a normal market, in a normal market, we've got these 2 months where we have really high demand for new listings, but we have very few new listings. And then as we come into May, that's when the largest number of properties come on the market. And then that continues to trend off, but still you can see all the way through September of last year, we still had more listings in all of those months coming on the market than we did in March and April. So if I'm sitting there in January, I'm having the conversation with the seller saying, look, most people want to wait until May, June, July, August to sell. However, what I'm seeing here is that we have the fewest number of new listings coming on the market during this time, and yet we still have similar amounts of properties going into contract, which is the red line here. And so this is a great time, and I mean, this is just true seasonally, and I would say this in almost any market, that March and April are some of the, February, if it's warm enough, February, March, and April can be the best times to list a house because the demand starts as soon as the weather breaks, but sellers are slow to get on the market. So if you can have your house ready. Obviously, we're in a very different time this year because of COVID. And so you can see the number of new listings is off substantially in this price range. And right now we're in a crazy time where, you know, more properties are going into contract than are coming on the market. And that seems like it's a really good thing. But what I'm starting to hear from you guys is that sellers are reluctant to put their house on the market because they don't have anything to buy. And this has been a problem for a few years, but it's way worse now than it's ever been before. And so what I'm talking to the seller about in this case is that we're in a really good place. And the reason we're in a really good place is because we have fewer listings coming on the market than are in contract. And that's a really good place to be. We also have, we have the same number of active properties actually in this case, this May compared to last May. But sales are down. And so that's one of the things that we're, you know, we don't know whether sales are down because inventory is down. We kind of hypothesize that's the case, but we don't know. So if we got a glut of new listings, it could impact what happens in the market. So that's why it's important if you're ready to get on the market soon. But then we come down here, and this is a new piece that Trend Graphics just kind of rolled out during this whole thing. And it's been really, really valuable, I think, to talk about what the market's like. And if we focus on this year-to-date number, we see that, again, the new listings are down almost 15% in this price range, but the pendings are only down 6%. So that bodes really well for the seller. So I'm going to go on that 30,000 foot view. Then I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to talk about the neighborhood. I'm going to talk about the average days on market. I'm going to talk about the difference between the average days on market and the median days on market. Now, obviously, is there a huge difference between 10 and 5? No. But sometimes if you're looking at bigger numbers here or a smaller sample size, the average days on market could be 10, 20, 30 days, sometimes even more than that, larger because of one outlier. In this case, we have that actually. We have one, the maximum days on market was 71 days. It was one house. If there only would have been 5 houses that sold in this neighborhood, it would have thrown off the average big time. But if you remember from whatever grade math that was, where they compared the average to the median is actually representing that middle number, meaning half the houses sold faster and half sold slower. So I like to always talk about the median as kind of an expectation. But again, to Lisa's point about the days on market when she was talking about expireds, what I would use this 71 days on market for was to explain the fact that this is what can happen if you overprice. And if we jump over here real quickly, we see that the property that was on the market for that long was a 1,200 square foot house, and it was priced just below where we were thinking we're pricing. And so it was probably a situation of overpricing. For that seller, money was way more important than time. And so that was fine. That was their choice. But
it's
again,
still counterintuitive though. It's still like super counterintuitive because the longer you stay on the market, the less money you're going to get.
but when there's no other inventory,
I guess so.
we're in a little bit of a counterintuitive world.
Yeah, I
Because
guess so.
you've heard the seller say, well, there's somebody out there that will buy my house at this price. Well, there might be if you're willing to wait that long, and if there truly is. But what you could also see is a bunch of people pass. But that's the difference between this market and especially, obviously, Hilliard, under 250, like there are new buyers entering the market every day. And so for all those new buyers, it's there's new eyes. I wouldn't recommend overpricing, but that, in this type of a market, like we've always said, this is the easiest one to make a mistake on and still be okay. So then after that, the last thing I'm going to do is go back to those properties that I had selected. And I'm just going to open up another new window here and go to my listing collections. And I would go through all these. And back in the day, I used to print them off with the pictures. I think now our team at least is doing everything digitally in terms of on a computer, kind of showing. I think there's a ton of value in being able to show the photos of the house to compare the different things, especially if the house is outdated, because otherwise they're going to latch onto the price and say, well, I should get this and I should get that and everything else. And you're going to have to say, no, actually you shouldn't, because if you were going to buy this kitchen or that kitchen, which one would you buy? Okay. But you do have to be careful though too, because the appraiser on the high end, the appraiser is not going to give you much credit for condition. So you do have to be careful that you're both in line with the square footage, bedrooms, bathrooms, as well as with the condition, because the buyers care about the condition, but the appraiser cares about the numbers. So that conversation for me often was, if it was in really great condition, my conversation around that was, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I don't disagree with you that in our current market, there's a good chance we're going to get multiple offers. However, here's what I would advise you to do. I would advise you to price it competitively with the average house at this price and allow the market to push you up. And what that's going to allow us to do is to get with competition, it's going to allow us to get some of those different benefits, such as appraisal gap coverage, such as no remedies, and different things like that. The reality is the purchase price is not the only thing that's of value in terms of a term in the contract. If you can negotiate no repairs at 250 or 245, but at 250 you're only getting one offer that has a normal inspection period and no appraisal gap coverage, getting 250 wasn't really worth 250. Because once you're paying for repairs and then you have to deal with appraisal and all that stuff, you might not be at 250 anymore. So you definitely sometimes have to have those objection handler conversations. And again, we're getting into more of the listing consultation, and I'm just having a conversation with myself. So you can see what must happen when I'm sitting in front of a seller. I was sometimes there for a while.
It's all really helpful. Keep talking.
So that's kind of my conversation and my process. And I would just I would go through here, and when I was doing it again, I would print it off and I would highlight all the things that were important about the property to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Like in this case, this property had a finished basement, and I know that because it was 1812 square feet. Now, the reason I probably wouldn't end up using this property is because it did have a finished basement. It's 2 full baths, but it also went on the market last May, which is a really old comp. And probably by the time the appraisal happens, it's not going to be valid. So I'll probably remove that. And then I would just begin to go through all these and break them down. So this one was from June. Now this one was our most comparable because it only had 1.5 baths, so I would probably keep it. This one, I'm just going to run through here and see. This one I would probably keep again because this gives me validation on that difference in price, which also that other one did. But I would pay special attention, and this is when, guys, to Marsh's point, you've sometimes got to dig for more information. Like these 2 properties that are in contract, are probably going to have more impact on what you can sell this house for than any of the closed properties because of COVID. The appraisers are looking more and more at what's happened since COVID than they are at anything else. Now, the only other thing, here's another example of digging in though, and we could never possibly hit every single objection that you could run up against, but this is a limited service listing, which is basically a for sale by owner that got listed in the MLS. So does this represent your ability to get maximum value? Probably not. However, they do have at least one side of the commission baked in there. This one had a finished basement, okay, which could be a perfect example of why you should use an agent, or maybe, you know, depending on what they got, but they have a finished lower level, super nice house, definitely more updated than the subject, and a finished basement. So, you know, we said somewhere between 235 and 245 for a list price. If this sold anywhere near 250, this has a deck, a finished basement, the 2-story great room. I'm very reluctant to go up and match 250. If this went into contract around 250, I'm definitely holding firm at 240 and telling them that they probably need to be closer to 235. Looking at this one here, this is a little bit less of an ideal floor plan. I know these floor plans really well, so I'll explain what I mean. You walk in, buyers don't like it when you walk in the front door and you have no like entryway and you're in the living room. This one's a little bit separated, but it's very, this is a very choppy floor plan, because then you've got the fireplace that you have to place furniture around, and then you've got this like open, what's supposed to be a dining room back here, but this picture makes the space look a lot bigger than it really is. And so this is one that kind of probably supports a little bit higher price on the other one, because even though it has 2 full bathrooms, the flow of this floor plan is not as nice. But then you start coming in, it's very nicely decorated. And again, the for one bath, the guest bath has been redone. Very clean basement, no fenced yard, but they do have a deck. And they are on a corner though. So now you have this exposure. I know for those of you that are newer in real estate, you always heard corner lots are good. Not really. They usually sell for less money, because your backyard is completely open. And then you also don't have railing around this part, so that eliminates your ability to use FHA financing. So again, this one is definitely on the high end, and this one supports maybe bumping up a little bit. And then lastly, we'll look at this one, and this one is in really good shape, very, very good shape. Nice flooring, completely updated kitchen. Looks like newer carpeting. Man, this one seems like it almost sold for less than it should have. And it has a finished space in the basement. No real back area. That might be a paper patio, can't tell with the snow. Backs up to power lines. So that's the last thing that I would go through here and look at. On our subject property, the first thing I would do is look at the map and make sure that it doesn't back up to power lines, railroad tracks, or a major road. So this one doesn't. The other thing you're looking for though, this one backs directly up to another house. If you had this guy over here that backs up to this wide open area, that's definitely a positive. I would then jump over to the auditor's site real quick and pull up the map if it's backing to an open area and you don't know what it backs to. I would go to the mapping part of the auditor's site. So let's say we were looking at this house, and I would click on this parcel, and I see the city of Columbus owns it, exempted because it's owned by the park district. That's exactly what you want to see, that it backs up to a park. And so I would say in this price range, that's probably worth another $5,000, maybe 10 to the right buyer, maybe even more to the really right buyer. But definitely I would give it a $5,000 bump. Finished basements are not the same price per square foot as above ground. So you're never gonna say like, oh, there's an extra 300 square foot in the basement. What's the average price per square foot? Okay, it's 171. So then, 171 times 300 is 51,000. Yep, it's worth $51,000. No, a finished basement is I think appraisers price them anywhere from like $15 to $35 a square foot, but it varies depending on the finishes and the quality of the neighborhood and stuff. But I would say in this price range, a finished basement's probably worth 10 grand, 5 to 10 grand, depending on the size, maybe 15. It's going to cost more than that to put in a finished basement, but it's just the appraisers will not give it the value. And unless it's finished super, super nice, it's not always going to be finished and functional for the buyer, to be honest with you. So, so you're going to be looking at that, and then you're going to go, again, the last thing that I'm going to do in these comps that I like is go in, and remember I said, so on this one, I was flipping through the pictures and I saw these power lines back here. In Hilliard, almost all electricity is underground. If you're in Clintonville, you're going to see power lines all the time. But in Hilliard, almost all electricity in neighborhoods is underground. So when I see power lines, it usually means that I'm near a busy street. So that's going to cause me to go look at the map. I do see I am correct in this case. So I'm backing up to Walcott. And so that's something I'm going to take into account when I'm looking at pricing. Now, what do I see here? I see that the market has been strong enough that backing up to a road means nothing. However, that's just not reality in a different market. So again, you need to let your buyer clients know. In this case, if you're representing the seller, you need to say it's your lucky day. It doesn't seem to be impacting the market. But if you're representing a buyer and I'm doing the CMA, I'm letting them know that in today's market, means nothing. But in every other market other than an extreme seller's market, 8 out of 10 buyers will choose a different house because of the power lines and the road. And it's just reality. When given the choice, buyers time and time again are going to move away from busy streets, power lines, and railroad tracks. The closer you are to them, the lower your value is in a buyer's market. And so you are going to love me if 5 years from now we're in a buyer's market and this buyer calls you as a seller and says, how come my house is selling $10,000 less than the house across the street? And you can say, Ash, remember when we were looking at houses and I told you that you were going to have to pay market value for this in this market? But in a buyer's market, your house wasn't going to be worth as much because it backed up to the street. And they were going to say, oh yeah. And not say that you want the I told you so moment, but you also kind of want the I told you so moment, because then they're not mad at you. Otherwise, it's your fault for not telling them. So, all right. That's kind of all I've got in terms of the way that I did it. I would just print all this stuff off and go from very, very 30,000 foot view to the neighborhood view and then down into the individual comps. What questions do you guys have?
That's a mic drop moment, Troy. That was awesome. I just learned a whole bunch. I got to watch this a couple more times because you do things a little differently than I do. I think especially with the amount of detail, like I wouldn't have thought about like, oh, if I see power lines, that means I'm close to a street. I would have never thought about that kind of stuff.
Like I said, lots of learning opportunities. These things wasn't born with those things, but definitely starting to pay attention as you have the experience, right, of
Yeah.
seeing houses and getting feedback from real buyers. That's one, you know, I will say there's a lot of value in showing buyers, but I will say the biggest value in being a listing agent, a really active listing agent, is seeing those feedback forms.
Yeah.
And pay attention and internalize those. Don't lean into what your seller is going to say, which is going to be, man, that's so stupid that that buyer said that. Hear that though, and don't lose that value, because the value of that piece of feedback, or if you're Ash Gale and you're doing all these open houses and you're hearing what buyers say, you know, under your breath, you can laugh at them all day long, but internalize what they're feeling when they walk through. And so many times buyers can't even verbally tell you why they feel the way that they do. But when you're at an open house and you're hearing the same feedback over and over and over and over again, I'm going to encourage you guys to sit back for 5 minutes, maybe let the open house end and walk through the house as an agent and say, like, what's causing them to feel this way? And if you guys do that at a super high level and you guys spend some time reflecting on things that are happening in your life, because there's such a tendency, and I'm terrible at this, there's such a tendency to never slow down and really internalize why things are happening the way that they do. But if you're a newer agent, the more you take advantage of those opportunities to learn, you're going to save yourself a lot of heartache and time in the future. And you're going to get really, really good at pricing.
Yes, and one thing just to keep in mind is, like Hilliard, it's not unusual to have Hilliard schools on one side of the street and Columbus on the other side. So today I had a listing appointment right off of West Case and Riverside, the condos, the Robin Ellen Hughes condos.
Yeah.
Those are, if I didn't really search that on the auditor's site, I would have said that realtor put the wrong school system in, because some of it's Dublin and some of it's Columbus.
Yeah,
So,
and I will tell you, back to, if we go back to my view that I set up in here, school district is one of the things that I put in my MLS view, and that's exactly why. And there are some neighborhoods, like you said, right around that part, like around Dublin, where in North Columbus, and then also when you get down south of 70 off of Renner Road or Fetter Road, where it's southwestern Columbus and Hilliard. And if you don't recognize that as a listing agent and you go in, boy, oh boy, can you be wrong on price. And you can be wrong on price big time. So that's a great point, Krista.
Hey, Troy, this has been great, but I just want to ask a quick question. Are there any special tips or anything? I know my parents' house, they're going to list theirs and sort of downsize in the next year, but they actually bought their house new at the end of an established neighborhood. And so do you have any tips for houses that are in a neighborhood but are very different and don't have an MLS listing? Because they bought from the builder and they never had an MLS listing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And like I said, this way that I did it, I wanted to stick with something that people could use the most of. When you get into that 20% though, that are very unique, including rural properties or infill properties like that, you really have to broaden your horizon. So you have to broaden your horizon while also rural properties are the most difficult because they're not really in a subdivision and within the barriers or guidelines. But for something like that, my recommendation would be the very first thing you want to establish is what are the price ranges within that neighborhood, because those are going to be your guardrails. It's going to be very difficult, even if you have, let's say, for example, you're in a neighborhood that was built in the 1960s and a house burned down, or somebody owned a double lot and they sold that lot off and a brand new house got built on it. It's going to be very difficult if the maximum house sold for $300,000 in that neighborhood to get $500,000 in that neighborhood. because
even if the houses are very different. I mean, like these infill houses, it was like 5 lots at the end of Scioto Run. And
no, so if,
yeah.
if there's more than one, then it's not going to be as difficult. But
none of the original owners have sold them yet.
Have sold, right? So the
Yeah.
comp is going to be difficult. So what
Yeah.
you're going to do, what I would do first is establish the guardrails of the neighborhood just to understand. Because here's the thing: certainly the neighborhood is going to have an impact negatively on the value. Because if they, like, let's say the rest of the new construction in the area is selling for 500, they're not driving by $300,000 neighbors on the way to their $500,000 house. So to get someone to do that, there has to be some value. So either it has to be an absolutely like amazing house, or you're going to have to come down on price. But
Gotcha.
then the second thing I would do, keeping that in the back of your mind, is I would go out within the same school district for sure and look at what are all the properties that have sold in the last 12 months that have been built. So like, when did they build their house?
So it was the year Lindsay was born, the next year, so it was 2001.
Okay. So I would go back and I would look at houses that have sold since 1995 in that school district, or that were built from 1995 to current, or maybe 1995 to 2010,
Mm-hmm.
and look at what those houses have sold for over the last 12 months.
Gotcha.
And if there's none of those, because the tough thing is a house that's 19 years old isn't new.
Right. And
So,
it needs to be updated in
Yeah.
places, although it's still really beautiful and they've maintained it well. But it is easily probably the most expensive house in the neighborhood. And I'm dreading the conversation that I'm going to have with them when they're ready to list it, because I know
Yeah.
they're not going to get what they've put into it. And I think my mom's going to cry about it.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's very, especially once you get older, because when you're getting older, when the homes are getting older, they become more and more like the homes that are there. So even though it might be 20 years newer, it's still dated, just like the houses that were built in the 80s are dated.
Right.
You know what I mean? Now
I gotcha.
the one flip side, the one place where that can be very valuable, if in the early 2000s they had the foresight to build a very open floor plan, then that would be the exception, because the floor plan is something that's really difficult to change. But if you're just depending on finishes that were really cool in 2001 to carry the value in 2020 and be worth, $150,000 more than the neighbor, it's going to be difficult.
Right.
And not to say that you're going to have to sell at the same price as the neighbor, but just recognize that that improvements have exponentially decreased in value over time.
Right. So I think what you're saying, just to recap, is to go in the same school district and look for similar properties and see what they're selling, and then sort of use the neighborhood as well as sort of a starting price point and figure it out from there.
Yeah,
And
I would start from the comps price, and then I would go to the very bottom of that range probably, and maybe even below it to adjust for the neighborhood.
Gotcha. Okay.
What about build quality? Does that come into play at all?
It
Well, that's a good
definitely
question.
does if it's significantly different. But if you're just going from, what's a good example? If you're just going like Chris, like if you were going from like MI to Showcase, and there was just like some crown molding and some other stuff, a lot of what the next step builder does in terms of like build quality are often finishes, and those finishes are 20 years old, so they're not even what people want to see in their house now anyways.
Now, this is 12 inches on center studs and
Yeah,
And
no
then
one,
the
no
rafters,
one,
instead of 10 inches, they're 12, so,
you're praying for an engineer buyer.
okay.
So
No, I'm
whatever
not praying, I just
percentage,
wanted to know.
yeah, whatever, and that, and honestly, like, Marcia, like, that's a great way to sell your clients on a house. But when I'm pricing, like, you're praying for an engineer buyer if you're factoring that in at all.
And the appraiser's not gonna note that at all, right?
The appraiser could care less.
Okay,
And that's the unfortunate part. And frankly, like, when you compare like Ryan Homes and, you know, Trinity and Miranda and all those guys, I mean, go look at what they sell their new homes for. I mean, I know a lot of times it's a lower price per square foot, but still it's not low enough compared to the difference in quality to Pulte or MI Homes or those people. And yet the number of $400,000 and $500,000 houses that people are buying from those builders is just mind blowing to me lately.
so the hardwood floors and the all granite and all that kind of stuff, it was just, it made me happy, but it's not gonna make any difference.
Yeah, that stuff matters as long as it's still in style to the buyer. It doesn't matter to the appraiser, but it matters to the buyer. The biggest challenge in this case, what Emily was asking about, is that that stuff is 20 years old. And so it's not even what today's buyer wants to see. So even though it was super expensive and super nice in 2001, every buyer that walks through is going to want to tear it out and replace it.
Right, I updated all mine, but it's like, it is, I mean, it's old, but it's all updated. I took all the oak out and put in the wrought iron, all that kind of stuff. But it's,
Yeah.
you just can't find one, you know, it's solid hardwood floors, which that was probably a waste of money, but they look nice.
Yeah, and honestly, like, and Krista obviously is here and she does a lot of new construction, but honestly, like, we were seeing, at least when I was still selling in the last year and a half or whatever ago, I haven't had this conversation in a minute, but like, I was still seeing like into that $500,000, $600,000, maybe even $700,000 range. Like, if you have somebody custom building an $800,000 house that has 2 Rottweilers that weigh 100 pounds, like, they're putting in the engineered flooring because they pay all this money for hardwood and it gets scratched by their dogs.
Well, the builders refuse to put it in. They just don't want to.
Yeah.
But, and they like the engineered, and I can understand the engineered now, I don't mind. But they keep saying that there's warping, but, you know, why wouldn't I have seen warping? I've got 2 dogs and I didn't have any trouble, but mine are smaller. So
yeah, it's one of those things. It's interesting to me because I thought that real hardwood was always going to be like, when I started seeing that in $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 houses, I about fell over. But buyers just don't like the maintenance that comes along with traditional hardwood floors.
Are you guys talking about the luxury vinyl plank or actually engineered hardwood?
Either.
Okay, because engineered hardwood can't be refinished at all. We just actually pulled up all of our first floor in the last 6 months and had solid hardwoods put in.
You can refinish that engineered floor one time, I hear.
depends on the floor.
It depends. Yeah, it depends on the thickness.
It does depend on the brand.
But back to her point, each house in this neighborhood is totally unique. They were all custom. So pricing it, I'm like, oh, holy crap.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of it, yeah, you're going to have to go. I mean, obviously, if anything's sold in the neighborhood like it, you're going to put a ton of weight on that. But remember, the appraiser has to have 3 solds.
Yeah, luckily we do.
So as long as you have them in there, the appraiser is always going to go with the ones in the neighborhood, even if you don't like the prices. But if there hasn't been anything sold in the neighborhood, Emily, and even on that, you're going to have a hard time getting the appraiser if there's similarly sized homes in the neighborhood, to not try to use one from the neighborhood or more.
That's a good point, and I'll bring that up when we get to that, because that's a very important point to do with any buyer, and that's to give with any buyer in that situation. It's an unfortunate, realistic conversation.
It really is unfortunate, and appraisers, like I said, in this environment, they're worse than ever.
Yeah.
But the other thing that you always want to be doing in this environment, and hopefully we're past COVID, but in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty, is whenever possible, be pricing off the actives.
That's a good point.
Because if you need to be better than whatever's on the market right now, in an uncertain time, because if something shifts, I mean, obviously we got some good economic news last week, but if we get bad economic news next week, the consumer sentiment changes overnight, and if you're not the next person that's going to sell, you can end up on the market several months from now wondering what happened, because the market shifts gradually and then suddenly. And just be careful in this market. And I would always, if, like, let's say we meet and I'm the seller, we meet today, and my plan is that I'm going to go on the market at the end of June. You need to be pulling comps like 3 or 4 days ahead of time again, to make sure that the house that was in contract that you assumed sold at or above list price actually did, and then making adjustments accordingly. I was just talking to somebody last week who went and did a listing appointment in February. The house went on the market the week COVID happened. It sat for a couple months because it was in a higher price range. But one of the comparables that they had based the pricing off of had actually closed before they went on the market, but it closed for $70,000 less than it was listed for.
Ouch.
And so they were basing their like active market, because in February there weren't very many actives, off of that one in contract, and they didn't go back and double check and make sure that that place sold for what it was in contract for, and then ended up listing this house, which was not as comparable, for the same price that that one sold for. And so it went from being a bargain compared to that one to being overpriced because of that one. And then what happened was other properties that listed after that, were pricing off of them and going into contract. And the sellers were like, what the heck? So I went back together with them and kind of walked through like all of those things. And it was plain as day, but not easy. It wasn't obvious, but those other properties had the benefit of seeing that this one was sitting on the market, and then they were able to price accordingly and sold. So, and then they did a reduction and it sold. But
going back to your numbers, the economic numbers from last month, I just read an article that said that those numbers were grossly inflated because they didn't count the ones that were furloughed.
I heard that too. I heard somebody say it in passing this morning, and I didn't know what they were talking, or maybe it was yesterday. And I didn't take the time to dig into it. But yeah, well, either way, whether they were inflated or not, the stock market reacted to them. So I guess we'll see if the stock market adjusts. But I think ultimately, like I said, I know 3 people that got laid off last week.
See,
and
it's going to be bad.
And so I just want to caution you guys, as much as things are going in the right direction, my cautious side of me is just saying, like, make sure that when you're pricing, you're getting these things sold quickly, because the reality is we don't know what 3 or 4 months from now holds in terms of the economy, and we don't want to get caught flat-footed pricing ahead of the market. You just need to convince your sellers that pricing for the market of today is the smartest thing. They have the opportunity to lock in a 3% rate. I did math on Friday, the difference between 1% rate change on a $300,000 mortgage. Does anybody want to take a guess at how much that is over 30 years?
It's like 50 grand or at least, right?
It's $60,000. So regardless of whether 4% is a good interest rate or a bad interest rate, I believe it's a really good interest rate. But the question is, if you have the ability to lock in 3% today and you live in that house for 30 years, $60,000 that you just saved yourself. If
The other side is the amount you qualify for, right?
Yeah, well, obviously you have to qualify for it. Come on, Marsh.
No. You get to you qualify for more when.
Oh, you qualify for more, right? Yeah, definitely. And the point in that conversation is so many sellers are worried, like, what if the values go down after I buy? Most likely, if you're buying a $300,000 house, we're not going to lose 20% in value, which is what a higher rate is going to cost you.
But maybe a dumb question, but I had this listing appointment today that they're going anywhere from like 588 to 650, 670. And the seller said, really, does the low interest rates make a difference with my sale of my property? And I mean, I said, yes, it did, but what would you have said?
I would say that the low interest rates obviously help buyers afford more and opens up your property to more buyers. However, it absolutely doesn't make it worth more than the comp that sold.
Yeah, no, I know that.
So as long as it's a benefit, it may help your home sell faster, but it's certainly not something that makes your home worth more.
Right.
What price point is a typical 25-year-old going in for?
I mean, it depends on what part of town, but I would
Yeah.
say if you're buying in the suburbs, there's not very much under 250 anymore, unless it's a condo.
That would make a big deal to them because they could more buying power for them.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely in the first time buyer conversation, it's different, but she said 600.
Yeah.
And that's not, I mean, most people in that price range have the ability to go higher and they just choose not to.
Mhm.
So it's a benefit, but it's certainly not a driver.
No, I was just asking because my kid's 25, so his sphere of influence, they're not quite ready, but they will be soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what the conversation with them is run what a monthly payment is on a house or condo compared to what they're paying for rent.
Right.
Guaranteed at 3% interest, you're getting a value.
They're just lazy. They don't want to have to maintain it.
Well, buy a condo. All right, guys, I'm going to jump off here. I appreciate
All
all
right, thank you.
Thank you.
Try.
sticking around. And like I said, by the end of the week, I'll record a Loom video on this that's, very much condensed.
Okay.
Good.
Thank
All right.
Thank you, Troy. Really good.
All right.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.